world full of stories. How does one author make their book stand out from the rest? Book trailers for authors. Breathtaking movie-style trailers that bring your book to life. Stunning cinematic video, epic royalty-free music. Packages starting at less than $200. Book trailers for authors. Makes a great gift for the writer in your life. Find us on Facebook at Book Trailers for Authors.
You are listening to the Barely Audible podcast. Hello and welcome to the Barely Audible podcast. My name is Justin Romine. I am one of your hosts alongside Bearz. Bearz, welcome.
Thank you, Justin. Good to be here as always.
Excellent. And today we have TJ English. He is a true crime journalist and writer based out of New York, I believe. And he joins us today to talk about some of his work. His most present book is The Last Kilo. Welcome, TJ.
Hey, glad to be here. How are you guys doing?
Great. Thank you. So let's kind of get started. What attracted you to true crime?
Well, let's start with that term, true crime, which is a term I don't really use. Although I don't object to it, it gets used. It's sort of an industry term to describe writings about crime. But you'll notice true crime, I don't feel any great identification with that term because if you go into a bookstore and you go to the true crime section, you're going to see a lot of books about wives who killed their husbands and husbands who killed their wives, and you're going to see serial killers, you're going to see psychological aberrations, you're going to see a lot of subject matter that doesn't really relate to what I do. I think of what I do as social history from a particular point of view, from the point of view of the criminal underworld. So I write about a particular type of crime. I write about crime that is connected to the social system, crime that is an outgrowth of politics and sociology and ethnicity and all these things. And so for me, it came from a desire to understand the inner workings of the United States of America. And I noticed that the country was born in violence. Violent revolution started the country. Manifest Destiny, the movement across the continent, was steeped in violence. The creation of American cities is all wrapped up in the criminal underworld and corruption and violence as part of that process. So somewhere along the line, pretty early on, as a journalist, really, before I even started publishing books, I became fascinated by this, what I call subterranean history, American history, that is kind of the hidden history in a way. It's certainly mostly history that we're not taught in school. And, I was raised to believe that a journalist is supposed to go out and get those stories that nobody else can get, to have a perspective that sheds light on things. So all of this sort of combined to start to draw me into this subject, because I didn't start out as any kind of a crime writer. I started out as a journalist who wrote about all kinds of things: sports, politics, entertainment, and crime. And it was the subject of crime that I kept coming back to for all the reasons I just explained.
That's great. So I noticed with your writing, you like to get as close to the subjects as possible. How does that influence your writing?
Yeah, great question. Well, when I write about crime, when I write about gangs or the criminal underworld or in any way, I try to do it from the point of view of the people who live the story that I'm writing about. And this is setting a high bar, because finding people in the criminal world who will talk to you and feel safe talking to you, trust you, is not an easy task. And so it's why, I mean, I've published 10 books now, but my books are often few and far between. And it takes time to find and cultivate sources in this way that will open up to you in this way. But it's absolutely essential to me to do it this way. Um, Anyone can tell the story from the point of view of cops and prosecutors. And I always include that point of view in the story that I'm telling, but it's not the primary focus. The primary focus is the criminal side of the story. And so I try to get those sources and get into the criminal side of the story and try to see it from the point of view of those people. So bringing empathy to it and understanding to it, dealing with the sources in a way that they know that you're not judging them. So a lack of judgment is a major thing, so that criminal people can feel safe talking to you. And one thing I've noticed is that's true across the spectrum in the criminal underworld. And I've interviewed a lot of gangsters from different ethnic backgrounds. They're very good at reading people. Criminals are very good at reading people. It's part of, I guess it's part of living a life on the other side of the law. You're
Yeah.
always sort of on the lookout or evaluating people you come in contact with. Can I trust this person? Is this person open to hearing my story in a way that's not judgmental? And so that is also part of the process. But yeah, it's very important. I don't think I would be writing these books or doing this kind of journalism unless I had the ability to uh, interface with these kinds of sources.
Yeah. And I also was been able to read a little bit of where the bodies were buried.
Yeah.
And I find that fascinating. You were present through the whole Whitey Bulger trial, right?
Yes.
And how did
Yeah.
how did that work as far as your research and putting together that book?
Yeah. That was a different kind of book because, I was bound by the trial. Basically, I was covering the trial, and that was the central narrative of that book. Um, I don't usually have those kind of constraints when I'm telling criminal stories. So this was going to be a story of, this was going to be a book about the legal process as it applied to Whitey Bulger. And I try to go back. I mean, I tell the story of the trial, and then there's constant flashbacks to flesh out the story of Whitey Bulger, the historical, cultural circumstances surrounding Whitey Bulger, and all of that. It was an interesting book to do because I went up and lived in Boston throughout the duration of the trial, a couple months. I lived in Boston for a couple months. I lived in the North End, which is the Italian section of Boston. I think I put on 10 pounds in those months because I was eating Italian food every day, some great Italian restaurants in that part of Boston. And I was just taking in the ambiance of the legacy of Whitey Bulger and the effect it had on that city. Um, so it was very fascinating that way. I got out of my little apartment where I was living and walked to the courtroom every morning and took in that trial. And it was, with a lot of these stories that have a broad historical background to them, um, it was a privilege and an honor to be able to take in the full dimensions of the impact of a story like that and try to present it in the book.
And you're also a music fan, jazz. Uh,
Yes,
so is Bears. Bears is pretty big into jazz as well.
good.
Uh, Bears, what can you share with him about your influence with music and jazz?
Well, there's so many interesting questions that I think we can ask TJ. And aside from the commonality of criminals or gangsters being able to read people, TJ, have you discovered other similar, like, common traits among, like, the criminal class that you found particularly interesting, or perhaps even surprising?
Yeah, well, yes, actually, I mean, I think. when you make a conscious choice to live as a criminal, to operate on the other side of the law, there's certain factors that come into play that have nothing to do with your ethnic background or even the social circumstance of where you're living. It just has to do with your relationship to the system, to the criminal justice system, to the economic system. It's comprehensive. It's a way of life. So anyone who adopts that way of life winds up having to submit to certain things. One of those things being you're committing crimes, or maybe you have committed crimes and you're wanted by the law, and you're on the lam, you're on the run, and all these things sort of dictate how you live. And so I've found that many criminal people have a sense of paranoia. But I guess I'm not even sure we could call it paranoia because it's a totally legitimate state of being when you're a criminal. It's not really paranoid to think that people are after you
Yeah.
because they are. Um, I mean, I often say to people, just to criminals I know, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean people aren't after you. They they probably are. Um, so there's that. There's also a certain thing. If the type of criminals I write about, which are mostly gangsters, people affiliated with criminal organizations and operating within that context. So these are people maybe who have killed people, or people that are operating in a world where people are getting killed and they know people who are killers. They operate within that fraternity of criminals. The interesting thing is and this surprised me, um, they tend to have a joy of life because they know life is could end at any time. And so they go out forward into the world with this sense of making the most of it while you can. So there's a sense of immediacy and spontaneity. If you ever hang out with these guys in a situation where they're partying or drinking or whatever, they're over the top. They laugh louder than most people. They're almost it almost feels like they're in a state of a kind of existential. They're walking the line between life and death, and so they have a sense of a heightened sense of living life. And you notice that right away if you spend time with them. And it can be a little unnerving don't if you've never experienced it before. And they're very suspicious about letting others into their circle. They're very suspicious about letting other criminals into their circle, much less a journalist or a writer or someone who's not within their life. Um, Anyways, it's an interesting thing to experience with them. That's one of the things I've noticed.
So,
And they
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Justin.
I was just gonna to point out that yeah, they also kind of lead these high octane lives and
Yeah,
enjoy doing stuff that most people don't normally do. And then in the case of Willy Falcone, he was a speedboat racer, correct?
a championship speedboat racer. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. I mean, that story, the Cubans in Miami and their involvement in the cocaine business, is really fascinating. It's a example of the kind of stories that I'm attracted to, which is a very exciting central narrative about their criminal life and the criminal organization that they created. But even more so, you can take that story and place it against the historical context and the times in which it took place. And that's always really important to me, because you're taking these criminal stories and you're elevating them to social history. So you're telling the story of the times in which they lived. And for Cuban exiles, this is an endlessly fascinating story to me. The Cuban Revolution, the the residue of the Cuban Revolution, the consequences of that for this generation of Cuban exiles, but also the consequence of that for the United States of America. and how that played out, because it played out right here in the United States. And if you've started to immerse yourself in that book, that Cuban exile criminal underworld is pretty damn fascinating and vast, and had a major impact on politics and many things in the United States of America. Certainly politics, the Cold War history, and the role that Cuban exiles in the United States played in the dirty war aspects of the Cold War is really important to, I think, to understanding the latter decades of the 20th century and on into the 21st century. And again, this is history that is kind of unknown to most people. It's not taught in history classes. And it's at the time it was happening, it was barely covered in newspapers and popular media. So this is hidden history that it takes us 30 or 40 years to come to terms with, because you'll only get sources to talk long after that story is over. So I often find myself doing these stories that occurred 30 or 40 years ago, because that's how long it takes for sources to feel comfortable to talk about this stuff.
Well,
Yeah.
is it difficult to get an accurate story after 30 or 40 years? Do the facts become diluted? The memories become a little bit more flexible? Or are people more forgetful? And if so, how does that affect your work? Trying to,
Yeah, that's
recreate the history.
yeah, that's a good question, because it is definitely a factor. And so what happens is, I try to apply all the standards of the highest levels of most vigorous levels of research, and validating your sources and cross-checking your information. So I do all of that. Um, I take nothing. Um, I rarely take something from a source just as told to me. I have to cross-check it. But often sources are telling you stuff that no one else was privileged to, and there's really no other way to check it. So you have to make a judgment call based on your degree of trust for this particular source. And you'll notice in the way I write these books, my footnote section is extensive,
Hmm.
and I'm very upfront about where I'm getting my information, who I'm getting it from. And my feeling is we're all adults. You can, as a reader, you can evaluate for yourself how legitimate you feel this information might be, um, and receive that information accordingly. So that's how I address the issue of factual information. But there's another interesting part of your question, and that is what happens when you're reporting on things 30 or 40 years later. A lot of it is folk history. You're
Hmm.
now entering into the concept of folk history. So you're getting people telling you stuff from 30 years ago, and it's how they remember it. And so, how vivid is that? How accurate is that? Well, again, I try to present that as folk history. And a lot of times in my books, there'll be places in the book where I'll go into first person accounts directly from that source. And I do that to make it clear that this is coming directly from this source. So you're free to judge this account to the extent you want to. But I mean, I usually probe these subjects pretty deeply. So if someone tells me an account of a murder that they were a party to back in the 70s or whatever, I'll interview them on that more than once. I'll go back over details. I'll try to get as much detail as I can. I'm cross checking the information. But part of that is I want to recount that incident with as much detail as possible to make it vivid and bring it alive for the reader. Um, so there's a certain amount of leeway that you're taking in recounting folk history. And all I can do is make it clear to the reader where that's coming from and the nature of how I received that information from those sources, and to let the reader decide for themselves. Now, you'll notice the way I address writing of books. I'm not what you would call a dry academic storyteller. I try to I write what people call narrative nonfiction. I use techniques of fiction writing to try to recreate the story as if it were a novel, and that's very important to me. Um, it's making it's making your storytelling entertaining and riveting, and because I'm very conscious as a writer that I'm competing not only with other books and other writers, I'm competing with all storytelling forms that are out there in the public domain. Um, Movies, the internet, friggin' TikTok and Instagram. You know,
Yeah.
these are all things that have captured the imagination of people, especially young people. And so I'm very aware of that when I write a book. I'm like, this has got to be gripping and entertaining. This has got to draw a reader in and hold their attention from the first paragraph, if not the first sentence, because reading a book is a very old fashioned thing. Let's
Yeah.
face it. I mean, it takes 20, 25 hours or whatever to read the average book. That's asking a lot from people in this short attention span era that we are operating in. So I'm very aware of trying to make the books entertaining.
There's a in where the bodies were buried. There's a story in there that has stuck out to me, and the details to me are lost. But if you could expound on this, there's the story of Whitey was leading somebody down into the basement, and he said something fairly profound before he put a slug in him. Can you do you remember this story?
You might be mixing two stories up, because that story about being taken down in the well, actually there's a few stories of being taken down into the basement. So I'm not sure which one you're referring to. There is one.
He said something along the lines of the person likes is going to be sleeping in the basement or something like that.
That may be the one of someone they believed was an informant,
Yes.
and they took him down in the basement, and they did kill him. He was killed down there in the basement. And I'm trying to think what he said also. Um, that's I have a lot of this stuff up in my head, and I
Yeah.
haven't refreshed myself on that one lately. But he does say something very chilling
Yeah.
right before he shoots him in the head. Um, yeah, I can't remember that. The story I thought you were talking about was another down in the basement story that was told from the point of view of a guy who wasn't killed, but believed that Whitey was bringing him down in the basement to kill him. And they have a little personal moment between the two of them. They're very well known. I mean, that's one of the things that always is um, eye opening to me about these criminal stories, the intimacy of it. I mean, I write about the Whitey Bulger story in particular,
Hmm.
guys who had known each other since childhood, who wind up killing each other, having to kill each other for one reason or another. It's very kind of poignant and intimate and sad, particularly sad. And this was a guy, Whitey, confronting a guy he'd known in the neighborhood since childhood. He felt the guy was, I think the motivation was the guy wanted out of the cocaine business. And that's always a dangerous thing in that world, when you let it be known that you want out of the business, because then you're a threat to them. You're someone who
Yeah.
knows too much. Um, so he brought this guy down into the business, and they started talking about old times. And he said he could even see the moment on Whitey's face where Whitey kind of decided that he wasn't going to kill him. It was like a dark cloud lifted, and Whitey decided, let's let bygones be bygones. And in that instance, he didn't kill the guy. Um, but the intimacy of those moments is always very chilling to me.
So how do you approach somebody that is deep in, the criminal underworld? How do you approach them to be a subject or an interview for your books?
Well, if you're lucky, like with this most recent book, The Last Kilo, they reached out to me.
Hmm.
Willy Falcon's daughter contacted me when he was in the final year of serving 27 years in prison. And she said, um, Willy Falcone is a fan of your work. He read a couple of your books while he was in prison. Prisoners that serve long terms in prison have a lot of time on their hands,
Sure.
and many of them are well read. I mean, they mostly read crime books, and so I'm accustomed to meeting people who've done long bits in prison who are familiar with my work. And the daughter said, he's thinking about wanting to write his story, and he wonders if you would be interested in doing it with him. And I was intrigued, but I didn't know him, obviously, and I didn't even know that much about his story. So I couldn't immediately say yes to that. I had to, it began a process of trying to connect with him in some way, and figuring out if we were going to be able to do this. It's usually not that easy. It doesn't usually fall in your lap like that. So it has to do with, and there's no, I can't give you one set answer to that applies to all the sources that I've approached. In fact, every single criminal source that I've approached has its own way of which I connected with that person. It's never, there's not a one size fits all answer to that. It has to do often, sometimes it has to do with reaching out to a criminal defense attorney of theirs first, try to find a way in that way. I mean, you've got to have some kind of personal connection, a way in. You can't just blindly approach a source and say, hey, I want to write your story.
Yeah.
Um, they're not going to trust you, and they're going to be suspicious. And it's not the best way to approach. In the criminal world, you got to know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody. That's the only way to have a proper introduction to somebody. Otherwise, nobody's going to trust you if you come in from out of the blue. You might be an undercover agent. You could be anything. Um, so, you have to have the right introduction. Criminal defense lawyers are often a good way to go about it if they're willing to do it and be helpful to you. I've had a few of those over the years. Um, I often catch people at the point at which their criminal story is sort of coming to an end. Like there's been a gang indictment. A couple times I've told the story around someone who came forward and became someone in the gang that came forward and became a primary witness against the gang. This was the case in my book, The Westies, also Born to Kill. These were stories that were told through a gang member that ultimately started to cooperate with the government secretly at first, and then wound up testifying against the gang, and sort of left the criminal life. So there's that way also. But um, there's no one way. Every book has a different story about how I went about gathering those sources.
And you sat down with Falcone a handful of times.
Yes.
What was the first meeting like?
Yeah. Well, it was a little like a blind date. And, you know, I'd had the opportunity to talk to him a little bit beforehand. In this day and age, with Zoom and cell phones and everything, you can establish relationships before you ever meet anyone face to face. I think this has created some problems in the romantic world. People thinking they know somebody because they've contacted with them electronically, and
Yeah.
then they meet face to face. It's similar here. Um, it was kind of exciting. I mean, the circumstances were that I had to go see him, and once he got out of prison, he was deported from the United States
Mm.
and wound up in a country that shall remain nameless. So I had to go see him to interview him face to face. It was complicated because it was right in the middle of COVID. So flying in and out of the country was difficult and fraught with all kinds of complications. And I missed flights on both ends of those trips because I didn't have the proper COVID test. And
Jeez.
it was a bit of a nightmare getting to him. But it was an adventure that kind of just added excitement to meeting him face to face, and it was pretty extraordinary. I get accused in my books of being sometimes overly empathetic or whatever to the criminals, and I cannot deny that I have a particular fascination with people in the criminal life because these are people that have made a conscious decision to cross over to the other side of the law and live a life over there. And it's unusual for people like you and me who were raised to follow the straight and narrow and have more or less made that choice. And um, the idea of someone who would choose otherwise is fascinating to me. And so yes, I am drawn to that, and I'm not drawn to it out of any kind of hero worship. I'm drawn to it because I want to know why. I want to know why, and I want to know how. I want to know motivations. I want to know what was in their mind and their heart that drew them in this direction. You know, because ultimately they're just human beings making choices and decisions in their lives like we all do. We would say they made bad choices, but whatever. These were the choices they chose to make, and I'm always very curious about what kind of person am I dealing with? What's the nature of their intelligence? How reflective and aware are they about what they did and what they've done? What degree of remorse is there about things that they were involved in? This is all fascinating human drama to me. So I was excited to meet Willie, and when I finally got to him, I knew I was had a limited amount of time with him. We basically had a long weekend together, and we just did these long, intensive interview sessions that were like 6 to 7 hours long, entire days. And then we'd go take a break, maybe have a meal together, and come back and do it some more, and then pick it up again the next morning. Very intense, very intimate, um, very emotional. You're going through the full gamut of emotional process as this guy is remembering the facts of his life, which included, by the way, the murder of his wife. Um, so it's always fascinating, and that was incredible. And I will say this also about that book and that source. I often write books about the criminal world where I don't have that level of intimacy and an inside source. I mean, I wrote a whole book about Whitey Bulger. I never met Whitey Bulger, never had the opportunity to interview Whitey Bulger, although I tried. I wrote to him. Um, so to have a, a source from deep within that world and tell the story from his point of view was kind of the ultimate to me.
So, TJ, at what point did you know this is the path you wanted to follow as opposed to writing about arts and entertainment for the Village Voice full time, or even becoming a jazz musician yourself, or taking any other number of career paths? What was it that inspired you about the dark side of humanity to want to follow it for 10, 11, 12 books? And the other part to that question is, at this point in your career, and having been on this path for so long, telling the story of the underbelly, what have you learned about yourself?
Yeah, good question. Well, I didn't start out as a crime writer or someone with designs to explore the underbelly as you describe it. I started as a journalist who covered all kinds of things, and as a journalist, I was drawn to the things that interested me, and so that was often music, and to an extent crime, and also politics, a little bit of everything. I was a generalist as a journalist, writing about all kinds of things. And so the the thing that was driving me at that point was all the technical things about being a good journalist and a good writer. How good are you at gathering information? How good are you at finding sources? How good are you at processing the information onto the page in a way that's fascinating and gripping for a reader? So these were the things that were motivating me during that period. And I always had an interest in the criminal world, but I wasn't overly enamored with it to the extent that I would become. Because from the first book, The Westies, which really didn't grow out of my interest in the underworld, it grew out of my desire to explore my own cultural heritage as an Irish American. And I had been writing primarily for Irish American publications in New York. So all these things I was writing about, music, politics, I was kind of covering from an Irish American point of view. Um, and so that was my identity as a writer at the time, and that's what drew me to the story of the Westies. But what was fascinating about the story of the Westies was they were the last in a long line of gangs from a neighborhood in New York called Hell's Kitchen, long line of Irish American gangs in that part of the city. And I began to get a sense of how deeply rooted these criminal stories could be in the social fabric and development of an urban environment. That was eye opening to me. That's when I began to see how important a point of view this was, that you were really telling the story of the development of America from a particular point of view. It happened to be a point of view that I wasn't taught about much in school. And it's not sort of the mainstream point of view. And so, an interesting side note to that, so to follow that path, one of the things that I had to do is stop being enamored with movies about the criminal underworld, because I'm dealing as a writer with real life, and this all often gets my goat. You start to talk about the criminal underworld or gangsters, and people start bringing up all the movies they've seen, and you have to remind them, those are movies, and this is real life. There's a difference. People think they know the criminal world because they've seen it so often on movies and in TV shows, and that can be misleading. So I realized also, you're not forget about movies. You're going to get sidetracked in your thinking if you're basing everything you're exploring on The Godfather or Goodfellas. Um, Leave that aside. You're dealing with real people in real lives. So that was interesting. So anyway, this view of the criminal underworld as some sort of essential road to understanding the United States of America, historically, culturally, everything, started to expand for me. And it became very exciting to me because at a certain point I realized I could go back in history and tell versions of this that were rooted in history. They were not just contemporary true crime stories about something that was happening now. The Westies, when I wrote that book, was happening now. I mean, they were being brought to trial, and that was a contemporary story, even though it had some historical aspects to it. The next book I wrote, Born to Kill, was about a Vietnamese gang in Chinatown in New York, and that was happening, boom, as I was writing it. And what I realized after those first two books, I don't know if I can sustain this, because those books required, having a firsthand source that you could tell the story through. And I'm like, I'm not always going to be able to find firsthand sources that are going to talk to me. I got to rethink this. So the third book I did was called Paddy Whacked, and it was a big sweeping history of the Irish American gangster. And that's and it was a more scholarly approach. It was involved archival research, and I was like, and I remember when I was writing that book, thinking, if I can pull this off, a narrative that starts with the Irish potato famine and winds its way through criminal underworlds in New York and Chicago and Boston and New Orleans, and right up to present day, Whitey Bulger. If I can sustain that narrative and hold it all together, there's nothing I can't do as an author and storyteller. And so that's when I realized I could have a career writing books, because I could go back in time and do archival historical versions of the criminal underworld, or I could do contemporary stories that were all based on firsthand interviews. Um, Now, how it affected me as a person, wow, we could easily do a full hour on that alone. Um, it's certainly kind of reconfigured my thoughts and perceptions about the country I live in, the United States. Um, because the historical background to so many of these ethnic stories I'm writing about involve the process of becoming an American for many ethnic groups in the United States of America, starting with the Irish, which I first wrote about. But the Irish, in some ways, kind of created the template for organized crime in America. They were the first one that established street gangs that had links to the political process, and that the gangs actually raised raised money and supported certain politicians that then protected them. And so the link between the underworld and the upper world, which is there from the very beginning of the creation of the underworld in the United States, and has been there ever since, and still exists to an extent today. And there are certain points in history where that has really enunciated itself, like the Prohibition era, for instance, where booze was declared illegal, and this huge criminal apparatus was created to deliver that product to the people. I mean, that basically is the template that exists today in the world of narcotics. It's the same thing, same process. So I started to realize that this concept of a criminal underworld is absolutely essential to understanding the true nature of American capitalism. The true nature of American capitalism, how the financial system in America operates, and also the levers of power and access to power, and just the process of becoming an American. This has opened my mind about what America really is. And it's punctured and pierced a lot of those illusions that we're taught to have as a kid about the glorious land of plenty, and how all men are created equal, and all the things that we want to believe about the United States of America. Also, one of the interesting things is, through my work, having interviewed a lot of people on both sides of the law, because I spend a lot of time interviewing federal agents and prosecutors and cops, um, I I tend to think of the criminal underworld and the upper world and the underworld as flip sides of the same coin.
Hmm.
I don't see them as separate universes. I see them as everyone operating within this world together. Now, there's those who chose to be on what they believe is the right side of the law, and they're motivated by that, and they think of themselves as the good guys. And then there's the guys on the other side, and I find they have a lot in common. They have certain things in common, and I find myself in to really get to the core of your question. I find myself identifying often more with the criminals than I do with the law enforcement people. And that's interesting. Even to me, that's interesting. I'm not even exactly sure why that is, but I think it has to do with the identification with the underdog, and that a lot of the criminal gangs and the criminal world in the United States really has its foundation in the idea of ethnic groups fighting for their piece of the pie. And that's an American story that I identify with strongly as someone who comes from immigrant stock, and having friends of all ethnicities who come from historical circumstances that are similar to that. And so I find myself identifying with that to an extent more than I do with the people who have chosen to represent the forces of authority. So I mean, I hope that answers your question.
Well, you seem to be a chronicler of duality and how it's playing out dramatically throughout history. And the interesting thing you just mentioned is they're really two sides of the same coin. What would
Yeah.
happen, for instance, if the underworld were entirely eradicated? Would the entire system at that point, capitalism, would it fail at that point? Would it cease to exist?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, but it's tough because I don't think that's possible.
No, thankfully.
I think one can't exist without the other.
Exactly.
And so the upper world, politics, the economic system, all of this is in some ways driven by, but certainly dependent on or influenced by the criminal underworld. Um,
How would you say people can reconcile that duality within themselves?
hmm, Jesus. A metaphysical question. I think my answer to that is, and I don't mean this to seem glib, but my answer to that is the answer I have to a lot of things, which is you start by acknowledging the existence of it and coming to terms with understanding the dimensions of it. This is why I write these books, to try to shed light on these things and to try to get people thinking in these ways. One of the greatest compliments I can hear is when people read one of my books and they'll say to me, and I do hear this frequently, they'll say to me, "You made me look at things in a different way. You made me see things about the existence of society or our cities in America or all these different things. You're making me see it in a way that I didn't really see it before." And that's where it starts. Lifting up the rock and looking underneath the rock and seeing everything that's there underneath the rock that you're not really supposed to see in the day-to-day existence of America. These are the things that um, it's kind of, as I said before, the hidden history. So I think you can start with acknowledging and understanding. And for a lot of Americans, that means breaking down this attitude of supremacy and entitlement that we have as Americans.
Yeah.
Start there. Yeah, we have this wonderful Constitution and all these founding documents and founding ideas, but how often do we live up to it? And are we even really intending to live up to it? Is there an alternative reality that's shaping this country and this world we live in that we're not acknowledging? So all of this about coming to terms with the truth, looking below the surface, beginning to see beyond the platitudes. This is, I feel like, my calling as a writer and dare I say as an artist who's living um, a lifestyle out to a degree outside of the system. I was a taxi driver in New York back in the 80s, and when I was working as a freelance journalist before I started writing books, and I would drive a cab only at night and then work as a journalist during the day. And still to this day, I think of the function of a cab driver as a metaphor for my role in the world. That I'm part of it, but a little bit separate from it. I'm in my cab. I'm driving around the environment of the city. I'm witnessing all kinds of things at the street level. I'm interacting with people from all economic strata of a dynamic urban environment. Yeah, I think of that as a metaphor for what I do as a writer.
Now, I'm about 15 or more years removed from uh, the Kennedy assassination, but I've always been really fascinated with it. And since I was a young kid, I've been reading books about the family and all of that. And it's kind of got their story, kind of has a little of everything in it. Um, you know, rise to power and tragedy and all of that. And you, as an Irish American, I'm sure, um, you know, grew up kind of paying attention to the Kennedy family. I'm curious if you have thought about tackling that as a book, the Kennedys, the assassination. There are also, a lot of gangster elements as well, the falling out and all of that. So, have you thought about tackling that issue?
It pops up in a lot of my books. It's in many of them, particularly the book Paddy Whacked, which is a history of the Irish American gangster. There's a whole chapter on Joe Kennedy, the father. The chapter is called The Patriarch. In many ways, to me, Joe Kennedy was kind of the hidden godfather of the Irish American underworld. So yes, I write about a lot. I'm never gonna write a book about it. I'm never gonna address it head on as a subject. There's too many books about the Kennedy assassination.
Sure.
But I wind up writing about it often because it's kind of the great unsolved crime of the last century.
Hmm.
And certainly any Irish American story I write, it winds up being part of it, including the Westies, and very much so in Paddy Whacked, and Jesus, even some of the other books like Dangerous Rhythms, which is a book about jazz in the underworld. But I write a lot about Frank Sinatra in that book, and
Yeah.
so there's a lot in there on Frank Sinatra's relationship to the Kennedy family. It's kind of a impossible subject to avoid if you're writing about the criminal underworld in America. The
Sure.
circumstances of it. I mean, I'll give you a thumbnail in Paddy Whacked. I don't get into the details of the act itself, like the grassy knoll and all of that,
Sure.
but I get into a lot of the motivation and circumstances that led up to the assassination from the point of view of Joe Kennedy's relationship to the mafia,
Hmm.
starting from very early in his life, and
Yes.
Joe Kennedy's manipulation of Sam Giancana and the first ward in Chicago, which delivered the election to John Kennedy,
Hmm.
and the mafia feeling, well, we put this guy in the White House,
And now
and
his brother's attacking
shocked,
us.
yeah, how
Yeah.
shocked they were when one of the first things he did was make Bobby Kennedy Attorney General, and
Hmm.
Bobby Kennedy launches a crusade against the mafia at an unprecedented level. The mafia was pissed off. In fact, they
Sure.
were pissed off enough to want to kill the guy.
Hmm.
And a lot of their anger was captured on tapes that were revealed years later, illegal wiretap tapes um, that were planted by the FBI. And so the mafia's attitude, you read those wiretap tapes of various mobsters around the country expressing their anger and animosity towards the Kennedys. You cannot be surprised that John Kennedy wound up getting shot. Um, so to me, there's a very strong causational link between the underworld and the assassination.
Yeah. And there's the ties to Cuba as well.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that because I wind up writing a lot about that in my Cuban books, and I've written a trilogy of books starting with Havana Nocturne and then The Corporation and now The Last Kilo. And yes, I mean the Kennedy assassination comes up a lot in those books because of the anti-Castro underground movement and its relationship, which was started by the Kennedy brothers, by the way, a CIA operation called Operation Mongoose
Yeah.
that was founded in the wake of the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. Yes, that's again a central narrative to understanding American history that we weren't taught much about in school.
TJ, how prevalent is the underworld in politics today, in your opinion?
Well, this is an interesting topic also because obviously it's changed a lot. It's no longer Italian and Irish and Jewish. It's no longer what is often called traditional organized crime. The founders of the American underworld, Italian, Irish, and Jewish, have gone through a process, have long ago gone through a process of assimilation and let go of the need for their connections to the criminal underworld. But in the 100 years or so since then, other ethnic groups have come along and plugged into this pre-existing system and used it. I think in answer to your question, you have to look at the world of narcotics. Really, the question is, to what degree is the criminal underworld connecting with the overworld in facilitating the flow and profit from illegal narcotics, all kinds of illegal narcotics, heroin, fentanyl, cocaine, pharmaceuticals. It's a massive industry. It's probably bigger than anything that's ever existed, in terms of the profit flow. And it's probably more powerful in terms of its influence in the political system. I refer to it as the narcosphere. The narcosphere. If you can bend your mind around this concept, the narcosphere is the arena in which narcotics business takes place, and it's a universe that spans boundaries. It spans national identities. It's its own world. And within that world are the criminal combines that create the product and aspects of the legitimate world that facilitate the business, the distribution of the process, the selling of the product, and the profit, that they may use to sustain their political careers or just to make themselves fat, rich, and happy. Uh, so the narcosphere involves Bolivia and Peru, where the coca plant grows, Colombia, where it's processed into cocaine, um, Panama, which has been kind of the central financial center for laundering profits, Mexico, which has kind of become the primary corridor for the transshipment point for bringing cocaine into the United States. And then, of course, the primary marketplace, the United States of America. This is the narcosphere, and it's incredibly profound and vast and influential in the mainstream process of politics. So, in answer to your question, I think it's alive and well and as strong as ever. It's no longer Al Capone or all these traditional gangsters that we often lionize in popular media through movies and television. It's a whole new world, but it's it's uh, it's as central to the functioning of the upper world as it's ever been.
And TJ, why are we seeing such an epidemic of meth use across America today? It seems like in every small town, you see these poor, helpless, they're almost zombie-like people staggering around, and it just seems to be in, you know, great epidemic these days. Is that coming from the same narco world?
Yeah, well, that's a big complex subject. I guess you could say, I think, to an extent, the criminal cartel's involvement in that, um, some to a certain extent, I think came about because they realized they were losing marijuana as a as a criminal racket. That marijuana was on the road to being legalized, and that they were losing a huge aspect of their business to the legalization of marijuana. And also, I think within the criminal underworld, there's a fear that the same thing might happen with cocaine. That cocaine could be decriminalized or legalized in some way, and so they're creating alternative markets. And meth and fentanyl and all this stuff are kind of driven by the desire to create alternative markets. Um, and when you get into the pharmaceuticals, then we get into this subject that I've never written about, but I'm fascinated by, which is to the extent that pharmaceutical companies and corporate America
Exactly.
is functioning as the deliverer of the drugs. And that's interesting. That's a new wrinkle in the narcosphere that never really existed until like the last 10 or 15 years.
Besides
But,
the gr-
when you talk about the zombies wandering, you know, whenever you think of narcotics, you have to think of it's helpful to think of alcohol and the fact that there was a time when alcohol was considered to be the devil, in the same way that these other narcotics are now presented as the work of the devil, and alcohol was banned. And as a society, we made a concerted effort to eradicate the use of alcohol within our society, and it was a huge disaster. It
Yeah.
had consequences that most people had never anticipated. It created organized crime as we know it in America. And you know why? Because people wanted their alcohol, and
Hmm.
they were going to have it by hook or by crook. They were going to have it no matter what.
Yeah.
And so part of the criminal world that was created around it was the inability of society to come to terms with the fact that people wanted it and they were going to have it. So if you were going to prohibit it, you ran the risk of creating this illegal delivery system that could
Exactly.
ultimately become so powerful that it would influence all of society. So when we think of meth or fentanyl or cocaine, you have to start with the reality that that people are going to use it.
Hmm.
They're going to find a way to use it, whether you make it illegal or not. And so you start there. And the decision we finally made with alcohol and the decision that we made with marijuana is okay, we're going to legalize these things. We know that they're not totally safe. We know that there's consequences from alcohol abuse and heavy marijuana use. But as a society, we say, well, personal liberty is a higher value. Personal liberty is written into our Constitution. So if people want to use it, we'll allow them to use it. It's kind of a higher level of maturity to reach that stage.
Exactly.
Because what you're saying is, all right, you're an adult. You we're gonna make available to you all the information about how destructive this can be. You're faced with an adult decision. And a lot of people will fail. It's true with alcohol. A lot of people
Hmm.
will fail, and we as a society deal with the consequences. Drunk driving. I mean, the drunk driving fatalities. The consequences of alcohol use are vast and profound. Um, we went ahead with marijuana legalization, not fully understanding what the consequences might be. I think it's an interesting test case because we can study, hey, what have been the consequences of legalization of marijuana? I tend to think right off the top of my head, it's not the end of the world,
Hmm.
like a lot of the hardline prohibition people said it would be. There's not a bunch of new marijuana users. I mean, basically, the people who want to use marijuana were using it anyway when it was illegal. Many people are never going to use marijuana, whether it's illegal or illegal. So
I
I
think.
think we
I
as
think.
we as a
Yeah.
society have to get to rethinking a lot of this stuff because obviously people want the drug and they're going to get the drug.
I think the larger question also might be who or what are creating the circumstances in these people's lives that make them so intolerable that they feel they need to self-medicate as well. What kind
Well,
of economic situation are they in, etc.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, that's you're thinking of it now as a social issue and not a criminal issue.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And we seem to be unable to. America seems to be unable to do that within the government anyway. I mean, I know there's a lot of private think tanks and everything that are asking these questions and addressing it, but as a government, we always double down on punitive measures. That seems to be all we know how to do is to punish people. I
Yeah.
think it comes from the old. I think it comes from the old Protestant mentality of punishing people who seek pleasure. That pleasure is dangerous and that we have to prohibit it on some level. And we can't get beyond that as a culture. And our our politicians pander to that. Every time there's election, politicians pander hard on crime. Tougher laws, crack down on all this stuff, punitive crackdown on all this stuff. It's sad to me. It's pathetic. It's like we're lost and we can't, as a society, we can't come to the terms with what are the root causes that drive our citizens at an inordinate rate, more than anywhere else in the world. What is it that drives our citizens to need this artificial panacea uh, to make our world tolerable to us? Now, again, this is another topic we could talk about for hours, but I think it has something to do with capitalism and the intense nature of succeeding in America, and profit motive and all those things. Yeah, I think it's all tied into that. And I don't have a lot of hope about our ability to address it as a society, but it's part of one of the reasons that I do write these do books and journalism that cover this subject.
Yeah, we definitely don't want anyone out in the listening audience to think that we're by any way moralizing or judging them at any point in their life. We would rather get to the heart of the problem so people maybe don't feel the need to have to self-medicate. And it's not a criminal issue, really. I mean, it is, and it has become one because of the profit motive from top to
Yeah,
bottom. From the judges down to the bondsmen to the
yeah,
jails, you name it. People are getting paid because of other people's poor choices or illness. Actually, I mean,
yes,
that's not done with diabetic medication. Certainly no one goes to jail
yeah,
because they're treating their diabetes, so why should
right.
it be any differently, right, guys?
Well, because it's illegal. That's what it all comes down to.
And if it wasn't illegal, there'd be no profit motive, there'd be
Yeah,
no greed element.
yeah, we'd be talking completely differently about cocaine, drug addiction, the need for drugs, the use of drugs. We'd be talking completely differently about it if it wasn't illegal. And I say this knowing how destructive that these drugs can be. I
Sure.
mean, I say
Absolutely.
this knowing how destructive alcohol can be. I've seen it in my own
Hmm.
family and my own community.
Mm.
I've seen it. Everyone has crazy cocaine stories to tell. We all love crazy cocaine stories. Um, you don't even have to be a cocaine user to know crazy cocaine stories. Just if partied in the 1980s or went to bars and clubs, you have crazy cocaine stories that you could tell. And they often involve friends, family members, people we know that couldn't handle it. So I say all of this knowing full well the dangers and consequences of narcotics use. So the question becomes, how do you address it? You can address it the way we've been addressing it, which I think has been an abject failure. I think the
Hmm.
war on drugs has been an abject failure. We've been spending trillions and trillions of tax dollars on the war on drugs for the last half a century, and cocaine and other drugs are still flowing into the country, and the narcosphere is alive and well. And you kind of look stupid if you just keep doubling down on policies that are not effective. So you got to rethink it.
Hmm. Yeah. And to sort of wrap this up a little bit, we'll go back to the last kilo. What can you tell us about Willie now? I understand that he's kind of um, gone gone away and nobody knows where he's at. Is that true?
Yeah, but I mean, he's trying to get a movie or TV series made of his life, of course.
Yeah.
That's probably not a surprise to anybody. And it's an interesting story because one of the things about that group, Los Muchachos, was they didn't use violence as a part of their business strategy when they were in operation out on the street. And that was kind of extraordinary to me because, the cocaine world of the 1980s we think of as an incredibly violent time. We
Yes.
all saw Scarface. Some of us have seen it 4 or 5 times. Miami Vice. I could go on and on. More recently, Narcos, the series. We These stories are inundated with violence. We're led to believe that the cocaine world is nonstop bloodshed from top to bottom. And so when I came across this organization that was the primary distribution network for cocaine in the United States in the 1980s, and the fact that they were doing this as a family, as an extended family, more as a criminal gang, and that they were doing it mostly without violence. They didn't use violence to discipline people within their organization. They didn't have wars over territory, none of that. And they functioned all those years that way. That was an eye opener to me, and it makes their story, I think, kind of unique and interesting in a way. Um, so maybe he'll have some luck with that. But one of the interesting things about dealing with guys who live this kind of life and bid long stretches in prison, and now I'm addressing them and asking them to look back on their lives. It's a really fascinating process. It's a fascinating human process, reflecting on your life and the life that you live. Because a lot of criminals, when they're in the middle of it, they don't reflect much. They get caught up in the survival aspect of what they're doing and not getting caught, and they're not particularly reflective people at the time. Years later, they're forced to look back on the damage that was done, both on a societal level and also in their personal relationships, how devastating it was for their families, their children, and these were things they just never thought about before, and now they're being forced to think about it, and they, I think, wind up in a permanent state of remorse in some ways about it. I mean, you have to be honest with yourself, but you also have to be kind to yourself. So it involves understanding that in some cases did all these horrible things, not so much in the case of Falcon, but I mean, right now I'm spending a lot of time interviewing a Vietnamese gangster who did 28 years in prison. He was a member of this Born to Kill gang that I wrote a book about. And he reached out to me all these decades later about wanting to talk about how it's been for him trying to get over and move beyond all of that, move beyond his past. And it's pretty fascinating to be a party to that as someone who's interviewing them and being a witness to their reflecting back on their lives and trying to come to terms with it, and you know giving themselves, forgiving themselves, getting to a state where you can forgive themselves. So we talk a lot of, with this guy, I'm talking a lot about redemption. Is redemption even possible after you've killed people and lived life as a criminal?
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us. It's been pretty enlightening listening to your stories, and definitely check out his latest book, The Last Kilo, along with all of his other books that are out there. You should be able to find by looking. Um, I think most of them are listed on your website.
Oh yeah, for sure.
We
Yeah.
actually need to
So,
have him back so we can talk about jazz at some point. We never got around to that.
yeah.
I'd love to do that. I live part of the year in Albuquerque, and my love of jazz has led me to believe a host of jazz performances. I did a Latin jazz series in New York that was called Dangerous Rhythms,
Oh, wow.
and COVID kind of brought an end to that series, but that was great. I love Latin jazz, Afro-Cuban music,
Yeah,
and
me
I'm
too.
right now trying to bring a version of that series to Albuquerque, a Latin
Oh, cool.
jazz series of concerts.
You
So
know,
hopefully that will happen, and we can get together and talk about that.
yeah,
Yeah.
growing up on Allen Ginsberg's farm, I had the pleasure of meeting a lot of jazz musicians, and Paul Bley became a good friend of mine. And we used to have pie and coffee every Tuesday in downtown Cherry Valley and talk about a jazz education from Paul Bley. Amazing.
Yeah, no kidding. That's great. Beautiful. Well, jazz is no longer the popular music in America. It was at one time. It was a phenomenon. It was bigger than rock and roll or hip hop or any of that stuff when it first came along in the 20s and 30s and 40s. Um, it's hanging in there. It's no longer popular, but it has people like us, and it's a wonderful point of connection with people who are jazz lovers. And I don't even mind that it's not the most popular thing anymore, because I like the fact that jazz lovers are people who have to seek it out, you have to educate yourself on it, because it's not going to be spoon fed to you by the popular culture. Jazz
That's
barely exists at the level of popular culture. And that just makes it more precious and enjoyable to us who love it and support it and sustain it.
you know who befriended me my first time at the Blue Note? Freddie Hubbard saw me walk in and he just locked eyes. It's like, oh, here's this white cat or whatever, right? He points to me and sets me down in the front row, and I always got a front row seat after that whenever Freddie was playing. He was just a magnificent human being and real sweet gentleman, you know? Real nice guy.
Well, the beauty of music, I think about this with jazz a lot. The beauty of music is the performance of music is not complete until you have a listener. So music is created by those who are performing it and those who are listening to it.
That's right.
And so it's a
Yeah.
community of lovers of the music, and musicians know that. And they love nothing more than someone who loves the music, even if they're not a musician themselves. They love that. This is and it's profound to them when someone has taken the time to study the music and really know it and love it. It completes the circle. It's part of the communal aspect and the power and the healing power of music.
Yeah. Well, thanks again for joining us.
Welcome.
It's been fantastic, and we will have you back on for sure.
Okay, I
And
look forward to it.
you've been listening to the Barely Audible podcast.
In a world full of stories, how does one author make their book stand out from the rest? Book trailers for authors. Breathtaking movie-style trailers that bring your book to life. Stunning cinematic video, epic royalty-free music. Packages starting at less than $200. Book trailers for authors. Makes a great gift for the writer in your life. Find us on Facebook at Book Trailers for Authors.